For 30 years, Margaret Chen had woken up on October 15th knowing it would be the hardest day of her year. But this morning felt different, because somewhere in the basement of First Baptist Church, a torn piece of fabric had just changed. Everything. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed photograph on her nightstand. Katie smiled back at her, frozen at 17 in her white choir robe, the same robe she'd worn to youth group that final Sunday night. Margaret's fingers traced the glass, a ritual as automatic as breathing. Every October 15th began this way, with Katie's face and the weight of 3 decades without answers. The house felt too quiet, the way it always did on anniversary mornings. Even the usual neighborhood sounds, dogs barking, cars starting, seemed muted, as if the world understood the significance of this date. Margaret pulled on her robe and padded to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding her through the motions of making coffee she wouldn't drink. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. A text from her sister, Linda. "Thinking of you today, call if you need anything." Margaret deleted it without responding. Linda meant well, but she couldn't understand. She hadn't lost a child to the void that swallowed 12 teenagers and left nothing behind. The local news played on the kitchen television, background noise she usually ignored. But today a familiar building appeared on screen, the red brick facade of First Baptist Church. Margaret's breath caught as the reporter's words filtered through her morning haze. Discovery of what appears to be a piece of clothing in the church basement has prompted police to reopen the investigation into the disappearance of 12 youth group members 30 years ago today. Margaret's coffee mug slipped from her hands, shattering against the tile floor. She stared at the television as crime scene tape flickered across the screen, yellow barriers now protecting the same building where she'd last hugged her daughter goodbye. Her phone rang. Pastor William's name appeared on the display. "Margaret, I wanted you to hear this from me before I'm watching the news," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. For the first time in 30 years, October 15th might bring answers instead of just grief. Margaret stood behind the yellow tape, watching Detective Rivera crouch beside an evidence bag that held what remained of her daughter's world. The basement of First Baptist Church smelled of damp concrete and 30 years of secrets, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the cramped storage room where Joe Mills had made his discovery. "Mrs. Chen, I understand this is difficult, but I need you to look at this fabric," Detective Rivera said, her voice gentle but professional. She held up the evidence bag, and Margaret's knees nearly buckled. White cotton, torn and stained, with delicate embroidered trim, she remembered, stitching herself for the church choir. "That's Katie's," Margaret whispered, reaching toward the bag before catching herself. "I made that trim by hand. Each girl had a different pattern." Her throat constricted. "Why is it here? Why wasn't this found before?" Joe Mills shifted uncomfortably. In the corner, his maintenance uniform wrinkled and stained with dust. "I was just replacing some old pipes," he muttered. "Found it wedged behind the water heater way back where nobody ever goes." Detective Rivera's pen scratched against her notepad. "Mr. Mills, how long have you worked here?" 15 years, give or take." "And you've never been in this section before?" Joe's eyes darted toward the basement stairs. "Not really. Old pastor. Brennan always said that area was off limits. Storage for old church records, he said. Current Pastor Williams never mentioned it one way or another." Margaret felt heat rising in her chest. "Off limits? Detective, my daughter and 11 other children vanished from this building. How was any part of it off limits during the investigation?" Rivera looked up from her notepad, and Margaret saw something flicker across her expression. Doubt, maybe frustration. "Mrs. Chen, I've been reviewing the original case files. The search of this building was limited." "Limited how?" "According to the reports, church leadership provided access to the main sanctuary, fellowship hall, and offices. The basement was deemed unnecessary to search because the youth group meeting was held upstairs." Margaret stared at the evidence bag, at the piece of fabric that proved her daughter had been here, in this forgotten corner of the building. 30 years, she said, her voice growing stronger. 30 years this has been sitting here. Detective Rivera sealed the evidence bag with methodical precision. "Mrs. Chen, We're going to search every inch of this building now. The cardboard boxes sat on Margaret's coffee table like accusers, their contents spilling across the glass. Surface in a chaos of yellowed papers and faded photographs. Linda perched on the edge of the sofa, her reading glasses reflecting the afternoon light as she sorted through witness statements with the methodical precision of a retired librarian. "This doesn't make sense," Linda said, holding up two documents. "According to Pastor Brennan's statement, the youth group meeting ended at 8:30, but the janitor says he locked up at 8:15 and everyone was already gone." Margaret's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Detective Thompson's name appeared on the screen. The original lead investigator, now retired and living in Arizona. She'd tracked down his number that morning, driven by the same relentless energy that had carried her through the church basement discovery. "Mrs. Chen?" His voice sounded older, weathered by years and desert heat. "I heard about what they found. I've been expecting this call for 30 years. Detective Thompson, I need to understand something." Margaret pulled a manila folder closer, scanning the timeline they'd reconstructed. "Why didn't you search the entire church building?" A long pause. "We tried to. Church leadership was cooperative to a point. Pastor Brennan gave us access to the areas where the youth group typically met, said the basement was just storage, no reason for the kids to be down there. But you could have insisted, couldn't you? Gotten a warrant? Mrs. Chen, you have to understand the climate back then. This was a respected institution, pillar of the community. We had no evidence of foul play, just missing kids. The assumption was they'd run away together, maybe to join some cult or commune. It was the 90s. It happened." Linda looked up. From the papers, her expression troubled. "Margaret, listen to this. 3 different witnesses say they saw the youth group leaving through the main doors, but the security guard who found the building unlocked says he entered through the side door and it was standing wide open." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Detective, did you interview the security guard who discovered the building was unlocked?" Another pause, longer this time. "Security guard? Mrs. Chen, according to our files, Pastor Brennan discovered the building was open when he came back for his forgotten keys." Margaret and Linda exchanged glances. Linda held up a police report, her finger pointing to a highlighted line. "That's not what this says," Margaret said slowly. "This says Harold Winters, night security, called it in at 11:47 p.m. Detective Thompson's voice dropped. "Mrs. Chen, I think it's time somebody took a very hard look at those original files. The morning crowd at Riverside Cafe had thinned to just a few regulars when Margaret spotted Carol Johnson hunched over a corner table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like a lifeline. 30 years had carved deep lines around Carol's eyes, but Margaret recognized the posture of someone carrying unbearable weight. "Carol." Margaret approached carefully, unsure of her reception. They'd been close once, united in grief and desperate hope. But time had a way of fracturing even the strongest bonds. Carol looked up, her expression guarded. "I figured you'd find me eventually. Saw the news yesterday." Margaret slid into the opposite chair. "We need to talk about this." "About what?" "They found—" "No." Carol's voice was flat, final. "We don't. I've spent 30 years learning to live with not knowing. I won't go through that hell again. But Carol, this could be our chance to finally what? Bring them back." Carol's laugh was bitter. "My husband left me 5 years after Michael disappeared. Couldn't handle my obsession with finding answers. I lost my son and my marriage to this case. I won't lose my sanity too." Margaret felt the familiar sting of isolation. She'd called 3 other families that morning. The Rodriguezes had been polite but firm. They'd moved to Florida to escape the memories. The Washingtons had hung up when she mentioned reopening the investigation. An hour later, Margaret stood on the porch of the Rodriguez family's old house, now occupied by strangers who knew nothing of the tragedy that had unfolded here. She'd driven past the Johnson house too, its windows dark, a for sale sign planted in the neglected front yard. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Some of us have found peace, Margaret. Don't destroy that for a piece of torn fabric." But as Margaret sat in her car outside the church where her daughter had vanished, she realized that peace built on unanswered questions wasn't peace at all. It was surrender. The other families could choose to look away, but she couldn't unsee what she'd witnessed in that basement. The torn choir robe proved Katie had been there, in that forbidden corner of the building. If the other families wouldn't fight for the truth, Margaret would fight alone. She dialed Detective Rivera's number, her decision crystallizing with each ring. The antiseptic smell of Pine Valley Retirement Home made Margaret's stomach clench as she followed the nurse down a hallway, lined with wheelchairs and forgotten conversations. David Brennan sat in the sunroom, his once commanding presence reduced to a frail figure in a cardigan, staring out at a courtyard where autumn leaves gathered in forgotten corners. Pastor Brennan. Margaret settled into the chair across from him, noting how his eyes sharpened when he recognized her face. Margaret Chen. His voice still carried traces of the authority that had once commanded a congregation. I wondered when you'd come. You heard about what they found in the church basement. Brennan's fingers drummed against his wheelchair's armrest. Terrible business. After all these years stirring up old pain, Margaret pulled out a copy of his original police statement, the paper soft with age. I've been reading your testimony from 1994. You said the youth group meeting ended at 8:30, and you locked up the building yourself. That's correct. But the security guard's report says he found the building unlocked at 11:47. Harold Winters called it in. Brennan's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the slight pause, the way his eyes shifted toward the window. I don't recall any security guard. I discovered the building was open when I returned for my keys. Harold Winters worked for the church for 15 years. You signed his paychecks. My memory isn't what it was, Mrs. Chen. The details from that night, they blur together. Margaret leaned forward. Your memory seems perfectly clear about locking up at 8:30, but you can't remember Harold Winters. Brennan's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cardigan. Those children were my responsibility. Do you think I haven't carried that burden every day since? I gave the police everything I knew. Did you? Margaret's voice grew harder. Because according to Detective Thompson, you controlled which parts of the building they searched. The basement where Katie's choir robe was found, that was off limits. Storage areas, old hymnals and Christmas decorations, no reason for the children to be down there. Margaret stood, studying the man who had once counseled her daughter, who had promised to keep the youth group safe. Pastor Brennan, why are you more concerned about protecting the church than finding out what happened to 12 children? Brennan finally met her eyes, and Margaret saw something that made her blood run cold. Not confusion or failing memory, but calculation. Some stones are better left unturned, Mrs. Chen. Sitting in her car afterward, Margaret's hands shook as she dialed Detective Rivera. Brennan wasn't protecting faded memories. He was protecting secrets. The bell above Walsh Photography's door chimed with the same tired note it had played for decades, drawing Henry Walsh from behind a counter cluttered with vintage cameras and yellowed wedding portraits. His weathered hands paused mid-motion when he saw Margaret, recognition flickering across his lined face like an old photograph developing. Mrs. Chen. His voice carried the weight of unspoken history. I've been expecting someone to come asking questions eventually. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. You remember me? I remember all the families. Henry gestured toward the back of his studio, where filing cabinets lined the walls like silent sentinels. I've been the church's official photographer for 40 years. Baptisms, weddings, youth events. I documented everything. Including that night in October 1994? Henry's shoulders sagged slightly, especially that night. Margaret's breath caught. You were there? At the youth group meeting. The police never interviewed you. Because Pastor Brennan asked me not to mention it. Henry moved toward one of the filing cabinets, his movements deliberate but reluctant. Said it would only complicate things, create unnecessary confusion. The children were gone. What good would pictures do? What kind of pictures? Henry pulled out a manila envelope, his hands trembling slightly. I was documenting the church's youth programs for the annual report. Took several shots that evening. Before... He trailed off, staring at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous. Before what, Mr. Walsh? Before Pastor Brennan asked me to leave early. Said they needed privacy for a special prayer session. Henry's eyes met Margaret's. Mrs. Chen, I've developed photographs for this community for 4 decades. I know when something isn't right. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. What did you see? Men I didn't recognize, adults who weren't parents or church members. They arrived just as I was packing up my equipment. Henry clutched the envelope tighter. Pastor Brennan was very insistent that I not photograph them, said they were visiting youth counselors from another church. Did you see these men leave? Henry shook his head slowly. No, ma'am, but I drove past the church around 10 o'clock. That night. Curious, you understand. The building was dark, but there were vehicles in the back parking lot. Vehicles that hadn't been there during the meeting. Margaret stared at the envelope in Henry's hands, understanding that whatever it contained might finally crack open 30 years of silence. Mr. Walsh, I need to see those photographs. The storage room behind Henry Walsh's studio felt like a tomb of forgotten moments, stacked floor to ceiling with boxes of negatives and contact sheets that chronicled decades of community life. Detective Rivera arrived as Henry pulled out a metal filing box labeled First Baptist, 1994, his arthritic fingers working the combination lock with practiced precision. Mr. Walsh, I need to understand why you never came forward with these, Rivera said, her voice carefully controlled as she pulled on latex gloves. Henry's hands stilled on the lock. Detective, I was 62 years old in 1994. I had a business to protect, a reputation in this community. When Pastor Brennan suggested I stay quiet, I listened. Margaret watched Henry lift the lid, revealing neat rows of contact sheets and negative strips. Her daughter's face smiled up at her from multiple frames, frozen in time with her youth group. Friends? But it was the final contact sheet that made Margaret's blood run cold. This was taken at 8:47 p.m., Henry said, pointing to the timestamp, after Pastor Brennan told me the meeting had ended. Detective Rivera leaned closer, studying the black and white images. These children are still in the fellowship hall. And these adults? She pointed to several figures in the background. You said Pastor Brennan claimed the meeting ended at 8:30. That's what he told the police, Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. But according to this, the children were still there nearly 20 minutes later. Henry pulled out another contact sheet. This is from my drive-by at 10 p.m. The images showed the church parking lot, clearly displaying license plates on 3 vehicles that hadn't been documented in any police report. Rivera was already on her phone, calling for a forensics team to process the photographs. Mr. Walsh, I need the original negatives. These images are now evidence in a federal investigation. Margaret stared at a photograph of Katie laughing with her friends, unaware that it would be one of the last images ever taken of her. Henry, why now? Why are you finally showing these? The old photographer removed his glasses, cleaning them with shaking hands. Because I've carried this guilt for 30 years, Mrs. Chen, and because yesterday Pastor Williams called me. Detective. Rivera looked up sharply. The current pastor? What did he want? He wanted to know if I still had any photographs from that night. Said the church was concerned about privacy issues with the investigation being reopened. Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. He offered to buy them from me. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. They're still trying to cover this up. The gravel road wound through pine trees for what felt like eternity before Margaret spotted the cabin, its weathered logs blending into the mountain landscape like a secret kept by the forest itself. Detective Rivera had insisted on coming alone first, but Margaret couldn't wait, not when the anonymous caller had whispered words that shattered everything she thought she knew. Sarah Mitchell is alive. A woman emerged from the cabin as Margaret's car crunched to a stop, and Margaret's world tilted on its axis. The face was older, marked by years of hidden pain, but the eyes were unmistakable. Sarah Mitchell, listed among the missing for 30 years, stood on the porch like a ghost made flesh. Mrs. Chen, Sarah's voice carried the weight of decades of silence. I saw the news about Katie's choir robe. I knew someone would eventually find me. Margaret's legs trembled as she climbed the cabin steps. Sarah, we thought your parents buried an empty coffin. They've visited your grave for 30 years. Sarah's face crumpled. I know. I've watched them sometimes from a distance, but I couldn't. I was too broken to come home. Inside the sparse cabin, Sarah poured coffee with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Margaret studied the woman her daughter's friend had become. Thin, watchful, carrying herself like someone always ready to run. "What happened that night, Sarah, please?" Sarah sat across from her, staring into her coffee cup as if it held answers to questions Margaret had been asking for 3 decades. The meeting didn't end at 8:30 like Pastor Brennan said. These men came, said they were from a youth outreach program. They had drugs, Margaret. They put something in our drinks during prayer time. Margaret's throat constricted. "All of you?" "Most of us went down fast, but I had a kidney infection. Wasn't drinking much that night. I pretended to be unconscious." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "I watched them load my friends into vehicles. Katie was so limp, so still. I thought she was dead. How did you escape?" "I hid in the basement storage room until they left. Found Katie's torn robe down there. She must have fought back somehow." Sarah met Margaret's eyes. "Mrs. Chen, Pastor Brennan wasn't just complicit. He organized the whole thing." Margaret felt her world reshaping itself around this terrible truth. "Where did they take them, Sarah?" "I followed the vehicles that night, stayed far behind. They went to the old meat processing plant outside town. The revelation hung between them like a blade, sharp and final. The fluorescent lights in the police station interview room cast everything in harsh relief. Sarah's haunted face, Detective Rivera's grim expression, and Margaret's hands gripping the table edge as if anchoring herself against the storm of revelations. Through the one-way glass, Margaret could see Pastor Williams pacing in the hallway, his lawyer whispering urgent instructions. "Sarah, I need you to tell us everything," Detective Rivera said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were uncovering. "Start from the beginning." Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for the water cup. Pastor Brennan had gambling debts, bad ones, the kind that get people killed. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He'd been stealing from the church collection for months, but it wasn't enough. Margaret felt her stomach drop. The youth group was collateral. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. The men who came that night weren't random predators. They were buyers. Pastor Brennan had arranged everything, the special meeting, the drugged refreshments, even the timing to avoid the security guards' rounds. Detective Rivera leaned forward. "You're saying this was a planned trafficking operation? 12 healthy teenagers from good families. Pastor Brennan got $50,000 per child." Sarah's voice cracked. "He told me this when I confronted him years later. Said he thought they'd just be adopted by families overseas, that he was giving us better lives." Margaret's world tilted. "You confronted him?" "5 years ago, when I finally got the courage. He was terrified I'd expose him, begged me to stay quiet, said revealing the truth would destroy what was left of the families." Sarah met Margaret's eyes. "He convinced me that silence was mercy." Through the glass, Margaret watched Pastor Williams stop pacing as Detective Rivera's colleague approached him with handcuffs. His face went pale as he realized his predecessors' sins were finally catching up with the institution he now led. "The current church leadership knew?" Rivera asked. Sarah nodded slowly. "Pastor Williams found Brennan's journals when he took over. Instead of coming forward, he chose to protect the church's reputation. He's been paying me to stay hidden, convinced me that exposing the truth would only cause more pain." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. For 30 years she'd mourned her daughter, while the very people she'd trusted for comfort had been covering up Katie's murder. "Where are they now, Sarah? Where are my daughter and the other children?" The silence that followed was answer enough. The red and blue lights painting the walls of First Baptist Church created a kaleidoscope of justice 30 years in the making. Margaret stood across the street, watching federal agents escort Pastor Williams from the building in handcuffs, his congregation gathering on the sidewalk in stunned disbelief. The same sanctuary where she'd once brought Katie for Sunday services had become a crime scene. Detective Rivera emerged from the church, carrying boxes of financial records, her team having executed search warrants simultaneously across the city. Margaret's phone buzzed with updates. 3 former board members arrested at their homes. David Brennan taken into custody at the retirement home despite his frail condition. Mrs. Chen, Rivera approached, her expression grim but determined. "We found Pastor Brennan's hidden files in the church safe. Bank records showing payments from offshore accounts, correspondence with the trafficking network. This goes deeper than we imagined." Margaret watched as congregants dispersed, some weeping, others arguing in heated whispers about their faith being shattered by institutional betrayal. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught Katie in Sunday school, caught Margaret's eye and quickly looked away, shame written across her weathered features. "The current board members," Margaret asked, "did they know?" 3 of them were on the board in 1994. They've been protecting this secret for decades. Rivera held up an evidence bag containing financial documents. Pastor Williams wasn't just covering up the past. He was actively laundering money through church accounts. The trafficking network has been using First Baptist as a front operation for 30 years. A news van pulled up, followed by another, then another. Margaret realized the story was breaking nationally now, 30 years of hidden truth exploding into public consciousness. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters, documentary producers, families of other missing children from across the state. Henry Walsh emerged from the crowd, his camera hanging around his neck like a confession. "Mrs. Chen, I'm documenting everything. Now." "No more secrets." Margaret nodded, watching as crime scene tape cordoned off the building where her daughter had last been seen alive. The church that had comforted grieving families while hiding the truth of their children's fate was finally being held accountable. But as satisfying as the arrests felt, Margaret knew justice was just beginning. The real work, finding what remained of 12 young lives, still lay ahead. The federal courthouse overflowed with 3 decades of accumulated grief as Margaret took her seat in the gallery, surrounded by families she hadn't seen since the memorial services of 1994. Carol Johnson sat 2 rows ahead, her earlier resistance to reopening the case replaced by a grim determination to see justice served. The Rodriguezes had flown in from Florida, their faces etched with the same mixture of vindication and heartbreak that Margaret carried. Sarah Mitchell approached the witness stand with the measured steps of someone who had rehearsed this moment in nightmares for 30 years. Her voice, when she began to speak, carried across the silent courtroom like a prayer finally answered. "Pastor David Brennan told me the children were merchandise," Sarah testified, her words cutting through the hushed atmosphere. "He said Katie Chen fought the hardest, tried to protect the younger kids. That's how her choir robe got torn. She was pulling other children behind her, trying to shield them." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in decades they weren't tears of helpless grief. They were tears of pride for her daughter's courage, even in her final moments. The prosecution's evidence filled 3 days. Financial records showing systematic money laundering, correspondence with international trafficking networks, photographs that Henry Walsh had finally surrendered after 30 years of guilt. Pastor Williams sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding presence reduced to a man who looked older than his 62 years. During recess, Margaret found herself standing outside the courthouse with Linda, watching protesters from the church defend their former leaders. "Some stones are better left unturned," one sign read, echoing Brennan's words from the retirement home. "They still don't understand," Linda said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "They understand perfectly. They're just choosing institutional preservation over truth." That evening, Margaret stood in the empty sanctuary of First Baptist Church, which had been stripped of its religious artifacts, pending the trial's conclusion. Sarah had asked to meet her there, and Margaret found her sitting in the front pew, where the youth group used to gather. "The federal investigators found the processing plant," Sarah said without preamble. "They're bringing in cadaver dogs tomorrow." Margaret's breath caught. After 30 years of not knowing, she might finally be able to bring Katie home. 1 year after the arrests, Margaret stood in the renovated sanctuary of what was now called Grace Community Church, watching sunlight stream through new-stained glass windows that bore the names of 12 children in brilliant colors. The old Baptist hierarchy had dissolved in the aftermath of the trials, replaced by an interfaith coalition dedicated to healing the wounds left by institutional betrayal. The memorial service drew hundreds, victim families, community members, and survivors of trafficking from across the country, who had found courage in Sarah's testimony. Carol Johnson sat beside Margaret, their friendship rebuilt on a foundation of shared truth rather than shared denial. The Rodriguezes had moved back from Florida, determined to be part of the healing process. Pastor Elena Martinez, the new community leader, approached the podium with gentle authority. "We gather not just to remember 12 beautiful lives," she began, "but to acknowledge how a community failed them, and to commit ourselves to never allowing such failure again." Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, no longer hiding, but not, yet fully at peace. The federal investigation had recovered the remains of 8 children from the abandoned processing plant, including Katie. 4 others remained missing, their fates lost to decades and distance. Sarah carried the weight of being the sole survivor, but also the honor of being their voice. Margaret touched the locket around her neck, a new piece containing a small portion of Katie's ashes. The cemetery service that morning had been private, just family and closest friends, finally laying Katie to rest in a grave that held more than just bones. It held truth. After the service, Margaret found herself in the church basement, now converted into a victim advocacy center. The room where Katie's choir robe had been discovered was now an office where trained counselors helped trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. On the wall hung Henry Walsh's photographs from that final youth group meeting, not as evidence now, but as remembrance. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Sarah asked, joining Margaret in the quiet space. Margaret studied her daughter's face in the photographs, forever 17, forever brave. "I think she'd be proud that her story finally got told." Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves like prayers across the parking lot where so much pain had begun. But inside, in the transformed space where secrets had once festered, hope was taking root. The truth had been devastating, but it had also been liberation.